webinar for the Delis rating of executive functions. Here is the agenda that of the information that we're going to cover this afternoon. I'm going to provide an overview of the new instrument and talk about its development and structure, Q Global, the online platform for the DREF and other instruments, tell you about the administration options and the reporting options, and I've embedded some data from a case sample to illustrate the report. Executive functioning describes a broad range of conceptually related cognitive and behavioral skills. Executive functions reflect the ability to manage and regulate one's behavior in order to achieve desired goals. Neither a single ability nor a comprehensive definition fully captures the conceptual scope of executive functions. Rather, executive functioning is the sum product of a collection of higher-level skills that converge to enable an individual to adapt and thrive in complex psychosocial environments. Executive functioning has been conceptualized as having at least 4 components: goal formation, planning, production of goal-directed behavior, and effective performance. These abilities suggest a higher-order cognitive awareness on the part of the individual interacting in his or her environment. So to demonstrate good executive functioning, an individual must reflect on what he or she wants to accomplish, determine what he or she needs to do to accomplish it, perform problem-solving behaviors to obtain the desired outcome, and then perform the action in an efficient manner. So each of these 4 executive functioning abilities can be dissected into smaller sub-skills that may be required to obtain desired goals and outcomes. Historically, these skills have been assessed through clinical observation of behavior and then cognitive tests, such as the Wisconsin card sorting test and trail making test. The behavioral problems associated with executive functioning deficits are well established, therefore. It's possible to identify potential executive functioning deficits through behavior ratings. The Delis rating scale of executive functioning is designed to quantify behavioral evidence for executive functioning deficits from parent, teacher, and self-reports. The DREF is a behavior rating scale designed to assess behaviors that may reflect difficulties with executive functioning. There are 3 rating forms: parent, teacher, and self. The parent and teacher rating forms may be used to rate children and adolescents ages 5 through 18 years, while the self-rating form is for children and adolescents ages 11 through 18. Each form has 36 questions to be answered by the rater, and after the 36 items are completed, the rater may also select 5 behaviors that are the most stressful for the child, which is beneficial when prioritizing interventions later on. The assessment can be administered digitally using a computer or tablet, or the forms can be printed and administered in a traditional paper-pencil format if necessary, and audio is available during online administration to accommodate examinees with reading or accessibility problems. Reports are available as individual score reports, multi-rater score reports, and progress reports, and I'll talk more about all of these in a bit. The DREF is specifically designed to assist in the assessment of children and adolescents suspected of having behavioral and cognitive problems, often associated with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder. Is designed to assist in the assessment of children and adolescents who are suspected of having behavioral and cognitive problems that are often associated with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, traumatic brain injury, learning disability, and other developmental and psychiatric, neurological, and medical conditions that are known to impact executive functioning. The DREF provides general information on an examinee's behavioral, emotional, and executive functioning and covers 4 specific areas of executive functioning: attention, working memory, activity level, impulse control, compliance, anger management, and abstract thinking, problem solving. Clinicians will typically use the DREF results in conjunction with other assessment results when making decisions involving determining a diagnosis or classification, or eligibility for special programs, planning interventions or treatment, and monitoring the effectiveness of a program. Individuals who are trained in the basic principles of psychological and educational assessment and test interpretation, the strengths and limitations of tests, and the use of assessment in database decision-making are qualified to be professional users of the DREF. Okay, as I mentioned before, the DREF surveys those executive functions that have a high probability of interfering with the child or adolescent's functioning on a frequent basis. These are behaviors that are likely to be of a source of stress to the child, the family, the teacher. The behaviors assessed by the DREF are frequently observed in commonly diagnosed developmental disorders, as I mentioned. And additionally, the DREF is designed to be easy to read, understandable for children, adolescents, and adults with low educational attainment. The items were intentionally designed for rapid administration to quickly identify symptoms that the clinician can then further evaluate with standard executive functioning assessments, such as the Delis-Kaplan Executive Function System. Extensive details of the standardization, validity, and clinical samples are provided in the manual, and I'm not going to go through that extensively today, but I'm going to touch on some of this in the next few slides. So here's the standardization sample size by age. Sex was not specifically stratified to be consistent with the U.S. Census data. Rather, sex was roughly stratified to be 50% male and 50% female by age group and in the overall sample. Normative data age norms adjusted by sex are also available in the DREF. And then for all examinees, parent education level was used for stratification. Information on parent education was obtained using a question on the consent form that asked the parent or examinee to specify the highest grade completed by each parent living in the home. For examinees residing with both parents, an average of the two education levels was used. So the normative sample was stratified according to 3 parent education levels, 0 through 11 years or never graduated from high school, 12 years high school graduate or equivalent, and 13 or more years education beyond high school. Let me go back and finish. Tell you about race and geographic region. For each age group in the sample, in the normative sample, the proportion of white, African American, Hispanic, and other racial or ethnic group examinees was based on the racial ethnic proportion of examinees within each age band in the U.S. population, according to the 2010 census data. And then the United States was divided into the 4 major regions specified by the 2010 U.S. Census report, so Northeast, South, Midwest, and West, and examinees were sampled from regions across the United States, but they weren't specifically stratified by region. Regional differences in DREF ratings were not expected and weren't identified. So each DREF form includes 36 items, with each item belonging to one of 3 domains: behavioral functioning, emotional functioning, and executive functioning. The DREF core index scores are derived from the domain-related items. In addition, a total composite score is derived from the 3 core index T-scores. These indices were initially derived based on content, and then the scales were reduced to 36 for each form using classical test theory indicators of poor item function and clinical effect sizes. And then exploratory factor analysis was also used to identify any mismatches in item index relationships, and some realignment of content was completed at that time. And then the items were also evaluated in terms of clinical functioning to validate the item index changes. So this table lists the core indices of the DREF, their abbreviations, and a brief description of each of the indices. These core index scores are available on all 3 forms. The DREF core index scores are scaled on a metric of a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10, so a T-score of 50 reflects the average performance of a given age group, and scores of 40 and 60 are 1 standard deviation below and above the mean, respectively. The items in each index represent various aspects of the construct being measured. As I mentioned earlier, executive functions represent a broad range of behaviors that comprise multiple independent and interrelated constructs. So the Behavioral Functioning Index assesses hyperactivity, impulsivity, poor organization, insufficient self-monitoring, and difficulty following rules. The Emotional Functioning Index assesses poor frustration tolerance, emotional lability, sensitivity to criticism, anger control problems, and interpersonal issues. The Executive Functioning Index assesses poor attention and working memory, cognitive rigidity, difficulty initiating and sustaining behavior, disorganization, and deficient problem-solving and decision-making skills. Each index measures multiple aspects of executive functioning. Therefore, when high scores are obtained on a specific index, it's helpful to review the individual items to better understand the specific problems that were endorsed. Here in this top section are some examples of items that are included in each of the 3 core indexes from the parent rating form. These same 3 are included in the same indexes on the teacher rating form as well, but I couldn't fit all that on one screen. And then on the bottom, there's 3 items that are included in each of the 3 core indices from the self-rating form. So you can see how the items map to the different indices, or an example of how they map. The clinical indices were developed to enable clinicians to identify patterns of clinically relevant symptoms. We think this will be particularly useful for working memory interventions such as CogMed. Those users are typically interested in tracking behavioral change pre-post working memory intervention. DSM-4 criteria and exploratory factor analysis were used to identify these second-level associations between items, the primary versus secondary factor loadings, and then these factor loadings were reviewed to derive the clinically relevant indices, as I mentioned. So here are the clinical indices of the DREF, their abbreviations and a brief description of each. They are also scored on a metric of a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10, so a T-score of 50 reflects average performance on the index. These clinical scores indices are more specific than the core indices, but each index still comprises a number of executive functions. The Attention Working Memory Index contains items related to sustained attention, shifting attention, forgetfulness, multitasking and working memory, and distractibility. The Activity Level Impulse Control Index measures hyperactivity, impulsivity, and disorganization. Compliance and anger management items reflect poor frustration tolerance, sensitivity to criticism, poor anger control, poor self-monitoring, and problems following rules. The Abstract Thinking Problem-Solving Index measures cognitive flexibility, abstraction, creative thinking, and general problem-solving skills. So here are some examples of how the items map to the clinical index scales, with examples from the teacher rating form on the top half of the page and examples from the self-rating form on the bottom half of the page. The parent, teacher, and self-rating forms are very similar in content and structure. In each form, the core and clinical indices have the same number of items. The parent and teacher content is nearly identical, which facilitates the comparison between ratings. The self-rating form is written, of course, from the perspective of the child or adolescent, and therefore the content, albeit similar, is different from the other rating forms. So when comparing response forms, it's important to remember that the items with the same number across forms may not have identical content, and they should print them out and compare them when performing item-by-item response comparisons. So the DREF was designed to be completed by various respondents who have knowledge about the daily behaviors of an individual and who've had extended and frequent opportunities to observe the individual's responses to environmental demands. Careful selection of respondents is critical for obtaining valid ratings. For all forms, respondents should have frequent contact with the individual. So for parents, maybe almost daily. Parents are caregivers. For teachers, that would mean several days a week. They should all have contacts of long duration, so for several hours for a contact or for each contact. They should have recent contact during the past 1 to 2 months, and they should have opportunities to observe the behaviors assessed by the DREF. For the parent rating form, respondents may include parents or other primary caregivers who are living with the child and who are familiar with his or her daily activities. So in addition to parents, grandparents, aunts or uncles, adult siblings, foster parents, and care providers from home living units and residential facilities can also complete the parent rating form. If desired, ratings from multiple respondents can be obtained for the same child or adolescent. So this is an example of a completed form, or the beginning of a completed form, showing the demographic section and the beginning of the instructions to the rater. This is for the parent. The parent and teacher rating forms both assume a 4th grade reading level, and in circumstances when it's not clear that the rater has sufficient education to read the forms, assistance may be provided in the form of having the items read aloud, and this may be done either manually by the examiner or by using the text-to-speech function that's available within the online administration in Q Global. The DREF parent rating form shows good to very good internal and retest reliability. It shows expected sensitivity to disorders with known executive functioning impairments and good specificity for disorders that have mild to moderate cognitive problems. The clinical indices yield additional diagnostically relevant information that's consistent with the presentation of the groups that were studied. The top 5 stressor model yields different therapeutic targets compared to evaluating only the most frequently occurring behaviors. The top 5 stressors are specific dynamic items that are identified by the rater as causing the most stress for the child and or the rater. The top 5 stressors rating is a unique feature of the DREF, and it was implemented with the understanding that the behaviors that cause the most difficulty for the child, the family, or the teacher may not necessarily be the behaviors that occur most often. Other rating scales often use critical values, but these are static items that are assigned by the developer. The top 5 stressor model provides the clinician a quick look at the behaviors that are causing the child the most problems in various environments, so home, school, and then from the perspective of the child, a parent, and teacher. So while these may not be daily behaviors, when they do occur, they cause distress for the child and individuals in the environment, and the clinician can make significant improvements in the life of the child, the family, or the teacher, or other kids in the classroom by focusing interventions on behaviors that are causing distress rather than just focusing on frequently occurring behaviors that may not be perceived as stressful. So the clinical results illustrate the types of problems, again, that often cause stress for parents and teachers, and importantly, these problems are often not the most frequently occurring behaviors. Therefore, focusing only on the most frequently observed behaviors would fail to highlight many of these difficult-to-manage behaviors. So the DREF parent rating form correlates in expected ways with other ratings of executive functions, including the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function, or BRIEF, which I imagine most of you are familiar with, although there is some behavioral divergence across specific measures. Here are some of the instructions on and the first few rating items from the teacher rating form. The DREF teacher rating form should be completed by the child's primary teacher. When the child has more than one teacher, the person in the school setting with whom the examinee has the most current and extensive interactions should be chosen as primary. The respondents for the teacher rating form should be familiar with the child's behaviors in a structured school or other service delivery setting, and whenever possible, professional users should obtain ratings from multiple respondents. So using multiple sources of information about an individual will improve the validity of the assessment and then, of course, can provide information about the degree of consistency of an individual's behaviors across settings in response to different environmental demands, and then from the unique perspectives of different respondents. All this information improves decision-making about diagnosis and assists in the planning of programs and services. The DREF teacher rating form also shows very good internal and retest reliability. It shows expected sensitivity to disorders with known executive functioning impairments and is sensitive and specific to children with mild to moderate executive functioning disorders. Using the DREF, teachers were able to identify subtle executive and working memory issues in children with learning disorders. The clinical indices yield additional diagnostically relevant information beyond the core indices, and the teacher and parent rating forms both show a moderate degree of concordance in clinical samples, although several differences are also observed. The top 5 stressors analysis here also yields different therapeutic targets compared to the most frequently occurring behaviors. And then, as with the parent form, the DREF teacher rating form correlates in expected ways with other ratings of executive functioning. So here are the instructions on and the first few rating items on the self-rating form. The self-rating form assumes a 3rd grade reading level. Similarly, if an examinee does not have sufficient reading ability, the items may be read aloud. Children with significant cognitive impairment should not complete the DREF self-rating form, even with reading assistance, however. So the DREF self-rating form has moderate to very good internal and retest reliability. The self-rating form also shows expected sensitivity to disorders with known executive function impairments, indicating that children with executive functioning disorders can reflect on their own behavior sufficiently to identify problem areas. Profiles of strengths and weaknesses in executive functioning are observed and consistent with diagnostic characteristics of the clinical samples tested. The parent, teacher, and self-rating forms show a moderate degree of concordance in clinical samples, although differences are also observed. The top 5 stressor analysis yields different therapeutic targets compared to the most frequently occurring behaviors for the self form as well as the others. And then the DREF self-rating form correlates also in expected ways with other ratings of executive function, although there's more behavioral divergence across the self-rating form than what is observed in the parent and teacher rating forms. Overall, the initial reliability and validity studies for the DREF indicate that it is a useful tool for assessing school-age children and adolescents with a variety of cognitive and behavioral issues. Many charts and more information about those studies are available in the manual. So the DREF is intended to be used as one part of a comprehensive psychological, psychoeducational, developmental, or neuropsychological evaluation. The symptoms assessed by the DREF extend beyond individuals diagnosed with common neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD, autism, and Asperger's disorder. The DREF can be used to screen for executive functioning deficits in anyone suspected of having problems in these areas, including but not limited to individuals suffering from a traumatic brain injury, a neurological condition such as epilepsy, metabolic disorder, prenatal exposure to neurotoxins such as cocaine or alcohol, infectious disease such as meningitis, neoplastic disorder, brain tumor, psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia or bipolar, or congenital disorders such as spina bifida or cerebral palsy. The DREF is useful in evaluations where behavioral, emotional, executive functioning deficits are being evaluated. The DREF helps the clinician identify those particularly salient behaviors that cause the most stress so they may be targeted for appropriate behavioral, medical, or psychological interventions. Okay, so diagnosis and classification. So as I mentioned, this tool is designed to help clinicians identify symptoms consistent with a variety of developmental disorders. And while the test is not diagnostic in and of itself, it points to symptoms that relate to common disorders of childhood and adolescence. So, for example, the DREF identifies deficits in attention and working memory consistent with ADHD inattentive type. Similarly, symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity can be identified and related to ADHD combined type. Compliance, argumentativeness, and anger control issues are symptomatic of children with oppositional defiant disorder. Cognitive symptoms of poor cognitive flexibility and abstract thinking, along with specific emotional and social symptoms, can be observed in autism spectrum disorders. These clinical groups are well defined in terms of the DSM-4-TR symptom clusters. However, the DREF is not limited to use in these disorders. Rather, the DREF can aid in evaluating and diagnosing a variety of clinical conditions in which executive functioning impairments are part of the overall clinical presentation. It's also useful in psychoeducational evaluations in which special ed classification is an important goal. It can provide behavioral data that can help teachers identify why a particular child may be struggling in the classroom. The problem may be behavioral, such as hyperactivity, impulsivity, or noncompliance, which in turn interferes with the child's ability to benefit from instruction without additional structure. Or the issues may be cognitive, such as deficient working memory skills or increased distractibility. In some cases, these higher-level cognitive deficits may result in a learning disability or an attention disorder, which can be corroborated with other clinical data. Some children may lack sufficient reasoning or abstraction abilities to understand classroom tasks and homework, and these children may be generally low-functioning or have specific problems with abstract thinking. So the appropriate classification and educational intervention plan can be facilitated by using information obtained by the DREF. Of course, it shouldn't be used in isolation to make diagnostic or classification decisions. It's designed to facilitate these processes in the context of a comprehensive evaluation. So the DREF is also a useful tool for research purposes. Studies evaluating executive functions in a variety of medical, neurological, psychiatric, and developmental disorders can use the DREF to identify specific profiles of executive functioning deficits. Also, item-level analysis can reveal even more specific types of executive functioning deficits that can be further evaluated with standardized cognitive measures. A primary research use for the DREF is in treatment outcome studies. For medication treatment or cognitive intervention studies, the DREF can be used to evaluate patients for executive functioning problems that are likely to respond to interventions. And then it can also be used to show improvement in symptoms after treatment through serial assessment. So it's well suited to research given its ease of use in a variety of populations and ability to be administered and scored digitally. And then it can be used to track changes in behavior over time. The DREF digital administration and scoring allows users to compare two assessments completed at different times. And this is particularly helpful to psychologists developing behavioral plans for children either in school or home settings. Comparing assessments can assist in determining whether or not treatment has been effective, and if so, the areas of functioning that benefited the most from treatment. It's also helpful for tracking the effects of medication therapy. Psychologists who work in conjunction with psychiatrists can track a child's response to a medication to determine its efficacy. And then symptoms may be tracked by either a single rater, for example, a parent rater at time 1 versus time 2, or compared across raters within an evaluation, so a teacher rater versus a parent rater in the same assessment period, which can be tremendously helpful. Monitoring multiple raters over time can really help the psychologist identify the environments where the treatment is working and maybe if there's an environment where it's not working. The self-rating form enables the clinician to monitor the child or adolescent's perception of the effectiveness of the treatment, and that information is helpful when the treatment is particularly helpful when the treatment requires an investment of time and effort by the child, such as using CogMed, the working memory intervention, or maybe a behavior modification. And so in this instance, the child can be encouraged by seeing his or her progress in specific executive functioning domains. The online scoring and reporting provides comparison data, again, between time 1 and time 2 evaluations, and this data includes statistical significance of the change score from time 1 to time 2 and the base rate of change. So the examiner is able to determine if the difference in scores is statistically reliable and if the degree of change is relatively rare or common. So I mentioned that the DREF is sensitive to common developmental disorders, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this here. Again, there is a lot of clinical validity data available in the manual, and I've just had a question about the normalization data. All of that information, including the inclusion-exclusion criteria and all of the statistics, are in the manual. And I'm sorry I couldn't cover it all here, but there's a lot. So I wanted to show, a couple of slides that have some examples of how it is sensitive to common developmental disorders. I want you to see how they're clinically useful here, in that even for the more subtle differences in ADHD types, for example, the DREF is able to differentiate. So this data is from the self-form. There is data from the teacher and parents that also illustrate this, but again, I couldn't put it all on here. So remember, the self-rating form allows the child or adolescent to identify difficulties that he or she is experiencing. The child-adolescent's ratings on the self-form represent, in part, the degree to which he or she has self-awareness of his or her behavioral, emotional, or cognitive struggles. And the ability to reflect upon one's behavior requires some degree of executive functioning and willingness to disclose personal limitations. In this ADHD combined sample, as expected, these children report significant problems with behavioral, emotional, and executive functioning with large effect sizes on all indices. The largest effect sizes were on total composite and attention and working memory index, and smallest for activity and impulse control, which you can see here, total and attention. Okay. So the data showed that the largest effect sizes for test items from the self-form indicate a high rate of frequency of occurrence, which are related to attention, conflict with adults, disorganization, and anger control problems. And then the most stressful items from the self-form on this particular study reflect behaviors causing the most distress, which relate to impulsivity, anger management, distractibility, and hyperactivity. The overall results from all three of those forms for this study are highly consistent with the diagnostic features of ADHD combined. There's a high degree of concordance in the level and the type of symptoms rated across parents and teachers. The behaviors that are experienced as most frequent and most stressful are very similar across parents and teachers. The self-ratings show that the children and adolescents are able to recognize cognitive and behavioral issues as a whole, although the largest effect sizes differ somewhat from those of parents and teachers, of course. The child and adolescent is also able to identify symptoms that cause him or her the most stress. So the DREF works pretty well in individuals diagnosed with ADHD combined. Here's the data from the parent rating forms for the ADHD inattentive study. So ADHD inattentive versus a matched control. These parent rating forms of children diagnosed with ADHD-I and controls indicate significantly higher levels of symptoms on most DREF indices. Among the core indices, the behavioral functioning and executive functioning. So here, erase. The behavioral and executive, it's here somewhere. Behavioral and executive functioning indices are statistically significant and both have large effect sizes. So for this group, the largest effect size is observed on this executive functioning index. And then all the clinical indices are statistically significant except the compliance and anger management index. The largest effect size was for attention and working memory here, and the smallest for compliance and anger management. The parent form items with the largest effect size represent the symptoms that occurred most frequently in the sample. These indicate a high rate of frequency of occurrence related to attention, distractibility, and keeping on task. But these are the 5 most frequently reported as the top 5 stressor from the ADHD-I parent form. So I mentioned that the rest of this data and much more is available in the manual. There's also going to be at least one workshop that will cover this in more detail. Right now, I believe that there's going to be a workshop at the National Association of School Psychologists annual convention next February in Seattle. I think it's an executive functioning workshop, but it will include DREF data. And I believe there may also be one at the National Academy of Neuropsychology conference in November also. So the DREF is divided into 3 types of scores. The most comprehensive score, of course, is the total composite T-score. This score comprises all the test items on the test and provides the most general overview of the child's behavior. The primary focus of interpretation, though, is on the core index T-scores. And these scores parse the child or adolescent's behavior into 3 broad domains, the behavioral, emotional, and executive functioning. They represent the more specific aspects of executive functioning than the total composite T-score. And then the third type of score is the clinical index T-score, and these scores are derived from item scores included across the core indexes. The clinical index indices describe specific symptom profiles that are associated with clinical syndromes. The recommended interpretation strategy, of course, is to report the overall composite T-score as a general representation of the child or adolescent's overall executive functioning. But since the primary focus of the interpretation is on the core indices, you would want to describe and interpret the core indices to differentiate the source of executive functioning problems, so behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and then evaluate the clinical indices to identify more specific types of cognitive or behavioral issues. And then finally, review the individual items and the top 5 stressors to identify the most frequent and most problematic behaviors. So between rater comparisons, then will provide you with information regarding the generalization of behaviors across environments, and then serial assessment, in which you look at the symptoms from the same single rater, can be compared from time 1 to time 2. Those evaluate changes in the frequency and associated stress of symptoms over time. So the DREF utilizes the T-score metric to describe the child or adolescent's rank order of executive functioning problems relative to the normative sample. The clinician may evaluate the T-scores using the entire normative sample or sex-specific norms, male or female. So for the DREF, the primary focus of clinical interpretation is restricted to scores of 55 and above. All scores below 55 are within normal limits. Low to very low scores, like below 40, don't represent superior executive functions. Rather, they suggest that specific behaviors are rarely observed in that particular child or adolescent. So therefore, a low score indicates a low probability of executive function problems. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about administration and reporting options. There is no formal kit for the DREF. All the administration, scoring, and reporting is handled via the online platform, Q Global, which I'll talk just a little bit about at the end, although there's lots more information available about that also. But if necessary, response forms may be printed out. In most cases, the DREP will be administered online. No outside materials other than access to the Internet is required. Links to the appropriate DREP form can be emailed to parents and teachers for at-risk students to identify potential problems. So if you need to email to the teachers, if you're an off-site clinician and need to email a teacher or need to email the form to the parent at home, that can be done. And then once the parent or teacher completes the form online, the clinician is notified that the rating is ready for automated scoring and reporting. I should probably point out that when that's done, you are not giving access to the parent or teacher to the online platform. That is done in a different platform that is specific only to that one assessment, and that's all they have access to. And although it's preferable for the rating form to be completed in a controlled setting, such as a clinic or school or agency office, as I mentioned, sometimes circumstances may require that the respondent complete the rating form offline, at home or somewhere else. So if that happens and it can't be emailed to them for some reason, the response forms may be printed out and supplied for this purpose, and then the scores may be manually entered into the online system. The completion, either way, is fast, easy, and it has easy-to-read clinical reports for quick identification of problem areas for the child. And in particular, the highly stressful behaviors that are identified by the DREF can become the focus of early interventions, which can help reduce stress in home and school environments. And then, of course, children who need to be referred, children who show a high level of symptomatology can be referred for more comprehensive evaluation and treatment. Once an administration has been completed and scored, you can run as many report variations as you choose at no additional charge. Multi-rater reports are limited to 3 individuals at any one time, but can be run multiple times with different combinations of clients. Progress monitoring reports are limited to 2 time periods, but can also be run multiple times with various time 1, time 2 combinations. I'm going to talk a little bit or show you some examples in a minute of the multi-rater form. So I want to say something more about the progress report really quickly, and that is just that when you're looking at a progress report, it comprises 2 administrations of the same form type completed at different times but for the same examinee. And the report will look similar to the individual score report based on the more recent of the 2 administrations, except that it will include time 1 versus time 2 core index comparisons and time 1 versus time 2 clinical index comparisons. But let me show you, just a little more about report options first. I've told you that clinicians may choose to use general population norms, which are adjusted for age, or they may select sex-specific norms, which are adjusted by age and sex. The score report also provides clinicians with statistical and base rate information for comparisons among the core and clinical indices, and also allows for comparisons of parent versus teacher, parent versus self, and teacher versus self ratings, like I've mentioned. And then the digitally administered forms will also include item response time as part of the DREF score report. These times, item response times, are not normed, but they're provided to help the examiner identify any content areas that may have been difficult for the rater or to identify protocols that may not have been carefully considered, so the examiner can quickly review the item response times and pick out outliers. And, of course, you can print out the top 5 stressors for review. Okay, so I'm not really going to do this as a case study, but I'm putting a report sample in here to show you the different pieces of the report. So I wanted you to have just this very basic information about J.S., a 9-year-old white male referred for psych eval to evaluate behavioral and academic issues as part of a psych eval. The DREF was administered. The mother, J.S.'s mother, and the teacher, Mr. K, also completed the parent and teacher rating forms respectively. And so the data that I'm going to show here is the integrated DREF report for Mrs. S. and Mr. K. So the report starts with examinee information, and you saw the demographic information earlier, all of which is provided by the rater. And then there's a core and clinical index score profile, which is a graphical presentation of the core and clinical T-scores. So this is the multi-rater score report shown here. It contains up to one administration of each of the different form types, remember, completed for the same examinee. This particular one, again, was completed by the parent and the teacher. This report is very similar to the individual score report, except that it includes the between-rater core index comparisons. Okay, so you can see the graphical representation. Here are the charts. The core index scores table identifies the raw score, the T-score, the percentile rank, and the confidence interval for each valid core index. So this parent rating form results indicated that JS had a severe elevation in behavioral symptoms and a mild elevation in executive functioning difficulties as rated by his mother. The total composite score of 64 showed a mild elevation in executive functioning related behavioral problems, I should say. And then from the teacher rating form, the core indices showed a severe elevation in behavioral symptoms and a moderate elevation on the executive functioning index. The emotional functioning index was within the normal limits or borderline range. The total composite was in the moderately elevated range, indicating a significant degree of general behavioral, emotional, and executive functioning problems. So the clinical index scores table, same data, or same raters, identifies the raw score, the T-score, the percentile rank, and the confidence interval for each valid clinical index. The core index comparisons table is a pairwise comparison of core index T-scores, not including the total composite. So data from the parent and teacher form clinical indices showed moderate elevations for attention, working memory, and activity level impulse control. A mild elevation was observed on the compliance and anger management index, while the abstract thinking problem-solving index was within normal limits to borderline elevated. And then also from the parent form, the behavioral functioning index was significantly higher and atypical, the base rates of 2.8 and 11.6 respectively, compared to both the emotional and executive functioning indices, suggesting behavioral control problems occurred more frequently than other problems. So that's not just statistically significant, but also highly unusual. You can tell by looking at the base rates. And then on the teacher form, the behavioral and executive functioning indices were slightly higher than the emotional functioning index, and the differences were atypical again, the base rate of 5.8% for the behavioral functioning index, and somewhat unusual for the executive functioning index, with a base rate of 17.8%. So this pattern of results would indicate that this child had very significant problems regulating his behavior at school. And then he also showed problems with cognitive functioning that interfered with his ability to function appropriately for his age. So this is the clinical index comparisons table, which is also a pairwise comparison of clinical index T-scores and shows T-scores for the two indices being compared, the difference, the critical value, significance, and the base rate for all the available index comparisons. The only clinical indices from the parent data that were significantly different from one another were the activity level impulse control versus the abstract thinking problem-solving indices, statistically significant at 0.05 with a base rate of 8.1. Oh, I'm sorry. Either I forgot to change or it was very slow to change. I apologize. Okay, here you can see where that is significant. So these results would indicate that this child is exhibiting significant symptoms of attention, working memory, hyperactivity, impulsivity, poor frustration tolerance, and disruptive behaviors in the home environment. And then the between-rater index comparison table here is also a pairwise comparison of core index T-scores. So looking at that teacher data, both the attention, working memory, and activity level impulse control indices were significantly higher. Am I off a slide? I apologize, y'all. No, I'm not. Okay, here we go, where the arrows are. So it shows that they're atypical compared to the abstract thinking problem-solving index with base rates of 2.7 and 4.8% respectively, indicating a significant problem with inattention, distractibility, and working memory difficulties. And then the top 5 stressors section of the report is a list of items and rater responses for the items chosen by the rater as being the most problematic for the examinee, remember. For our 9-year-old, the most stressful symptoms as reported by his mother were related to anger outbursts, disruptive behavior, poor frustration tolerance, impulsivity, and lack of effort. The specific items endorsed indicated a profile of inattention, distractibility, forgetfulness, impulsivity, hyperactivity, difficulty sustaining and initiating effort, and disruptive behavior, and problems with frustration tolerance. You can see the teacher section. The teacher endorsed items indicating off-task behavior, distractibility, forgetfulness, impulsivity, sloppy, messy work, hyperactivity, multitasking problems. And the most stressful items for this teacher were related to poor effort, disruptive behavior, hyperactivity, and distractibility. And then the final section of the report, which I don't show a slide of, is the item response table, and it's an optional piece to the report. You don't have to select to generate it or print it. It presents the response frequency and the latency for each, or the response and the latency for each item. So this particular kid was referred for additional evaluation for symptoms of attention and hyperactivity. In the case study that we have, and I think we'll cover this in more detail at a later point, we show more of this particular case and looking at an overtime after a working memory intervention assessment. Right now I want to move on and talk just a little bit about the Q Global platform. For those of you who are familiar with our Q Global is the web-based version that we're now beginning to load with assessments, including the DREF. Q Global provides a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week secure web-based access. It's portable, can be used on mobile devices such as a laptop or a tablet. Online ordering is available through Pearson's current e-commerce site, and it provides on-demand, reliable scoring and expansive, I said expensive, and it's really not. You'll see in just a few minutes. It's reliable scoring and expansive and comprehensive reporting solutions that are not available through hand scoring. And you can access your Q Global account through any internet-connected device to manage and retrieve examinee information, to generate scores from assessment data, and to produce the reports. And all of these activities are performed in a secure, private web environment that helps professionals streamline their assessment workflow while complying with widely accepted data privacy standards. Here is a screenshot of the resource library that's available within Q Global, and you can see right this minute we have loaded the Dial-4, the MCMI-3, the WARMT, and the DREF, and then I'm showing you here, under the DREF, this folder that has resources in it. It contains documents and files that are related to the assessment products available on the system, and it's set up by product, as you can see, with subfolders in each. So this section is located in the menu bar in Q Global at the top of the screen throughout the system, and it can be accessed anytime you're logged in. The manual, which is available there, the manual to accompany the DREF can be downloaded or it can be referenced in the resource library section of Q Global, and these are included in the manual. The introduction, of course, general testing, administration, and scoring guidelines, development information, lots of development information, lots of evidence of reliability and validity, interpretation information, and then in the appendices, somebody asked a question earlier about the criteria for the clinical sample. That information is included here in the indices. The index intercorrelations by age and information about the examiners. This is a screenshot that I took when I walked through the process. This is the screen where you go to select which report to generate. You can see at the top that I have selected DREF individual score report. You can also see that I have checked all three there. I guess I hadn't yet done the multi-rater. The multi-rater is what I ultimately generated, and I would have selected it right there at the top. And you can use filtering information here if you're going to search for somebody. For example, if you have a large number of examinees in your system, and then you select the examinee at the bottom and generate the report. And then another screen will open to let you select the report, print the report. So this slide shows the link to the Q Global system. It's part of our website, sitecore.pearsonassessments.com, and then you can see the rest of the image there. This will be in the handout. I don't think you've gotten the handout yet, but this slide is in the handout, and you can use this link to go straight to the Q Global system. So I want to thank you. I hope that I've managed to impart the information about the DREF in a manner that helps you understand how versatile it can be and how useful it can be in providing the clinician with information about child and adolescent executive functioning. The optional online administration of the DREF enables you to distribute the scale easily to raters either by email by email. And then, of course, as I mentioned, it can be printed and handed to them if necessary, too. And then the scoring and reporting being generated automatically by the scoring software is a tremendous benefit. The DREF provides a global index of overall executive functioning and core indices that evaluate the source of executive functioning deficits, which can occur in behavioral, emotional, or cognitive domains. A more refined level of analysis is presented in the clinical indices, which relate to symptoms associated with specific aspects of executive functioning difficulties and the DSM-4-TR symptoms for some of the common pediatric disorders that I talked about. The DREF allows the examiner to make those statistical comparisons between raters to identify reliable and atypical differences. And this evaluation of different raters then can inform the clinician whether symptoms are generalizing across environments or whether they're specific to one environment or another. And the parallel structure of the parent and teacher rating forms allows for that item-by-item comparison that I talked about to further elucidate the nature of executive functioning problems. And then the serial assessment comparisons enable the clinician to track symptoms over time to determine empirically the effectiveness of therapeutic interventions. If you'd like more information about the DREF or other Pearson products, I've listed here and will be included in your handout 2 pages of the assessment consultant and assessment representatives for the states, the school representatives and the MHC representatives and consultants. We really appreciate the opportunity to share this overview presentation on the DREF. Put in a question and you want to ask a question, my email address is here on this last page. It will also be on your handout. If you'll email it to me, I will either answer the question or get the information from the appropriate person, be it the research director or someone else. Let's see. I don't guess there's any right there that I can see that I can answer or that haven't already been answered. All right. Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate it very much. We're going to repeat this webinar in September, but in the spring we plan more in-depth webinar looking more at interpretation and looking at the overtime assessment. So thank you.